The discovery began on an ordinary Tuesday evening, the kind of evening that tends to blur into the others in the endless cycle of routine. I sat in my small, cluttered study, bathed in the soft glow of my desk lamp. A faint hum of life filtered through the walls, distant chatter from the television in the living room, the rhythmic ticking of the clock above my door. I had always found solace in this room, surrounded by books and the quiet hum of my own thoughts. But tonight, a restless energy gnawed at the edges of my mind. It started innocently enough. I was searching for an old receipt, a mundane task to prove the warranty on our coffee machine that had finally sputtered its last puff of steam that morning. Pulling open drawers and flipping through folders, I stumbled across a small, unfamiliar envelope tucked away beneath a stack of tax documents. The envelope was worn, the corners slightly bent, as if it had been handled many times. My name wasn't on it, and I hesitated for a moment, the weight of an unspoken rule pressing against my curiosity. But the temptation was too great. "It's probably nothing," I told myself as I slid my finger beneath the flap and unfolded the paper inside. What I found was not nothing. The note was short, written in a handwriting I didn't recognize, neat but hurried, as if penned in a stolen moment. "Thank you for yesterday. I can't stop thinking about you. Same time next week?" My breath hitched, the air around me thickening like a fog. I read the words again, my heart pounding louder with each pass. A dozen questions flooded my mind at once. Who wrote this? When was it written? And why was it here? I set the note down carefully, as though it might combust in my hands, and leaned back in my chair. My pulse thundered in my ears. Suddenly, the walls of my study felt too close, the air too still. My mind raced, replaying the past weeks, months, even years, searching for what? Signs, clues, anything that might explain this fragment of a secret now lodged in my reality. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the note as if it would unravel its secrets if I looked hard enough. The words seemed to pulse on the page, taunting me. My mind cycled through possibilities, each one more improbable and painful than the last. This could be a misunderstanding, I thought. Maybe it isn't what it seems. But the rational part of me, a part I wasn't sure I wanted to listen to, whispered otherwise. My wife, Emily, wasn't home at the moment. She'd gone to her usual book club meeting, one she never missed. That thought landed heavily in my chest. Book club. How could I be certain anymore? I folded the note carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it exactly where I'd found it. I needed time to think, to gather my thoughts before rushing into a confrontation I wasn't ready for. That night, I lay in bed beside her, my body stiff and my mind reeling. The soft scent of her lavender lotion, the same one I had loved for years, now felt like an intrusion, a cruel reminder of the intimacy we shared, or thought we shared. She turned to me at one point, her hand resting lightly on my chest. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. "I'm fine," I said quickly, perhaps too quickly. Her eyes lingered on me, searching, but I couldn't meet her gaze. Instead, I pressed a kiss to her forehead and turned off the bedside lamp. Darkness enveloped the room, but it couldn't quiet my thoughts. The next few days passed in a haze of forced normalcy. I went to work, exchanged pleasantries with colleagues, came home and played my role as a loving husband. But inside I was unraveling. Every smile she gave me felt like a question, every touch a test. It wasn't until Friday evening that I found my next clue. Emily's phone sat on the kitchen counter, buzzing softly with a notification. She was in the shower, her voice carrying faintly from the bathroom as she hummed one of her favorite tunes. I glanced at the screen out of habit, expecting to see a message from a friend or one of her book club members. Instead, I saw a name I didn't recognize. Mark. My stomach churned as I stared at the notification. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Same place?" Time seemed to slow. My hands trembled as I reached for the phone. It was unlocked, and with a shaky breath I opened the message thread. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. The messages between Emily and Mark were intimate, flirtatious, too familiar. My breath caught in my throat as I scrolled further, piecing together their conversations. They had been meeting for months. The details weren't explicit, but they didn't need to be. The intent was clear. I set the phone down, my chest heaving. The walls of the kitchen seemed to close in on me, the air thick with betrayal. My mind swirled with anger, hurt, and disbelief. How could she do this? How could I have missed it? The sound of the shower turning off jolted me back to reality. Panic surged through me. I grabbed a glass from the sink, filled it with water, and sat at the kitchen table, forcing my expression into something neutral. A moment later, she walked in, her hair damp and her face glowing from the heat of the shower. "There you are," she said with a smile. "I was starting to think you'd fallen asleep out here." I looked at her, at the woman I had loved and trusted for over a decade, and felt a strange mix of fury and sadness. For the first time, I truly didn't know her. "I was just thinking," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "About us." She tilted her head, a hint of concern flickering across her face. "Is everything okay?" I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to make her explain. But instead, I just nodded. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Everything's fine." The investigation began quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow creeping across the edges of my life. I couldn't rush in, couldn't let emotion take the reins and risk being wrong, or worse, letting her know I was on to her. If there was any hope of clarity, I needed patience. It started with the basics. While Emily went out the next morning, claiming she had errands to run, I sat down at the desk in my study and began combing through her digital world. Her email was the first stop. Most of it was mundane: receipts, newsletters, and the occasional chain mail from her mother. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then I checked her calendar. One entry stood out. It wasn't labeled with any detail, just a time block for personal meeting. The location was blank, but it was recurring. Every other Saturday, same time. Today's date matched. My chest tightened. This wasn't proof, I told myself, but it's something. Next, I turned to her social media. Emily had always been cautious about what she posted, keeping most of her life offline. Still, I scrolled through her history, looking for any hint of inconsistency. Then I noticed something subtle but telling. In several photos from the past few months, she was wearing the same necklace, a delicate silver pendant I hadn't seen before. It seemed innocuous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was significant. When she returned home later that afternoon, I played it cool, acting as if nothing had changed. "How were the errands?" I asked, folding a pile of laundry in the living room. "Fine," she said, a little too quickly. "Just the usual. How was your day?" I shrugged, feigning indifference. "Nothing exciting. Just catching up on some reading." I glanced at her, searching for any sign of guilt or nervousness, but her expression was unreadable. If there was something to hide, she was doing an excellent job of it. The next step was more invasive, but I justified it with the gnawing need for answers. That evening, while she slept soundly beside me, I carefully retrieved her phone from the nightstand. The messages with Mark were still there, confirming their plan to meet earlier that day. I took screenshots and sent them to my own email, making sure to delete the evidence from her phone. Then I noticed something new. A photo, buried deep in her gallery. It was a picture of Emily, smiling brightly, standing beside a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, with dark hair and an easy grin that set my teeth on edge. The background was a small cafe, one I didn't recognize, but knew wasn't in our usual haunts. The photo was dated 3 weeks ago, a day I distinctly remembered her saying she was working late. My hands shook as I stared at the image, my heart pounding so loudly I feared it might wake her. I couldn't look at her face in the photo without feeling a bitter twist of pain. I needed more. Confrontation still felt premature. I wanted undeniable proof. The following Saturday, when her recurring personal meeting was scheduled, I made a decision that felt both desperate and necessary. I followed her. The morning of the personal meeting, I woke early, my heart heavy with anticipation. Emily moved about the house, her routine unremarkable but her demeanor oddly chipper. She hummed as she sipped her coffee, her smile quick and easy. It was the kind of mood I might have found endearing under other circumstances, but now it only deepened my resolve. When she kissed me on the cheek and said she'd be back in a few hours, I forced a smile. "Have a good day," I said, my voice calm and even, masking the turmoil within. The moment she pulled out of the driveway, I was in motion. Grabbing my jacket and keys, I followed at a discreet distance, my car blending into the weekend traffic. She headed downtown, weaving through streets I knew well. My palms grew damp as I gripped the steering wheel. "Where are you going?" I wondered. After about 20 minutes, she turned into a small parking lot beside a cozy cafe I'd never visited. I parked a block away, far enough not to draw attention, but close enough to keep her in sight. She stepped out of the car, her figure framed by the morning light. She wore a simple outfit, a cardigan and jeans, but there was a lightness to her step, a quiet confidence that felt out of place. Then I saw him. The man from the photo emerged from the cafe, his expression lighting up the moment he saw her. He walked toward her with a casual stride, his hands in his pockets. She met him halfway, and to my horror, they embraced, an intimate, familiar gesture that spoke volumes. I sat frozen in my car, my mind racing as I watched them walk into the cafe together. My chest felt tight, every breath a struggle. The evidence was irrefutable now. This wasn't a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, or a fleeting mistake. This was deliberate, but I needed more. I waited 10 minutes before stepping out of my car. The cafe was small and inviting, its windows adorned with cheerful flower boxes. I entered quietly, scanning the room until I spotted them. They sat at a table near the back, leaning in close, their conversation animated. Her laugh, one I hadn't heard in months, rang out softly, and he reached across the table to touch her hand. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. My instinct screamed at me to confront them right then and there, to demand answers and expose the betrayal. But I held back, my anger tempered by a cold, calculated need for closure. Instead, I found a seat at a small table near the counter, far enough to remain unnoticed, but close enough to overhear snippets of their conversation. "Missed you," he said, his voice low and warm. "Me too," she replied, her tone soft and intimate. They talked about mundane things, work, plans for the week, but the subtext was clear. This wasn't just a casual friendship. There was a history here, a connection that had no place in my marriage. I sat there for an hour, the weight of their interaction pressing down on me. When they finally stood to leave, I quickly exited the cafe and slipped back into my car. I watched as they embraced again in the parking lot, their goodbye lingering before she returned to her car. As I followed her home, my mind churned with questions. How long has this been going on? Why did she do this? What does he have that I don't? When we arrived, she entered the house as if nothing had happened, her expression serene. I sat in the car for a few moments, gathering my thoughts. The time for subtlety was over. I had seen enough. I stepped into the house, my heart pounding with a mix of rage and sorrow. Emily stood in the kitchen, humming softly as she unpacked groceries, a facade of normalcy that now felt like a cruel joke. I paused in the doorway, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on me. I had rehearsed this confrontation in my mind a dozen times during the drive home, but now, standing there, words failed me. Finally, I cleared my throat. "Emily," she turned, startled, a bag of apples in her hands. "Oh, hey, you're back early." Her smile faltered when she met my eyes. "Is something wrong?" I stepped closer, the air between us charged with unspoken tension. "I need to ask you something," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me, her brow furrowed. "Of course. What's going on?" I pulled out my phone and opened the gallery, where I had saved the screenshots and the photo of her with Mark. I held it up so she could see, the screen glowing between us like a damning spotlight. "Who is this?" I asked, my tone sharp and unforgiving. Her face went pale, the color draining away in an instant. The bag of apples slipped from her hands, scattering across the floor. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. "Emily," I pressed, my voice rising. "Who is he?" Her lips trembled as she finally found her voice. I can explain." I shook my head, my anger surging to the surface. "Explain? Don't insult me, Emily. I followed you today. I saw you with him. I heard you. Do not stand there and tell me this is something it isn't." Tears welled in her eyes, and she reached for me, but I stepped back, the distance between us growing with every passing second. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "It's not what you think." I laughed bitterly, the sound foreign to my own ears. "Not what I think? You've been lying to me for months, maybe longer, sneaking around, meeting him, laughing with him, touching him. And you have the nerve to tell me it's not what I think?" Her tears spilled over, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as if in prayer. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered. I stared at her, the woman I thought I knew, now a stranger before me. "Then tell me, Emily, what happened? When did you decide our life wasn't enough? When did you decide I wasn't enough?" She crumpled onto the nearest chair, her sobs racking her frame. "It started last year," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "We met at a work event. At first it was just talking. He listened to me, understood me in a way I hadn't felt in so long." Her words cut deep, each one a jagged blade that tore through the foundation of our life together. "And what about me?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. "Was I just a placeholder? Someone to come home to while you built a life with him on the side?" "No," she cried, shaking her head. "I love you, I swear I do. I never meant for it to go this far." "But it did," I said coldly. "You made a choice, Emily. You chose him, over me, over us." She reached for me again, her hand trembling. "Please," she said. "We can fix this. I'll end it, I promise. Just don't give up on us." I stood there, her words hanging in the air like smoke, suffocating and cloying. Part of me wanted to believe her, to hold on to the fragments of what we had built. But another part, the part still reeling from betrayal, couldn't fathom how we could ever come back from this. The days that followed were a blur, each moment heavy with the weight of unspoken words and shattered trust. Emily tried to reach me, through words, through gestures, through the quiet tears that seemed to come unbidden. But I couldn't bring myself to respond, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, sorrow, and confusion. I slept on the couch the first night, though sleep was a distant stranger. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of her with him flashed in my mind, vivid and mocking. The warmth we once shared now felt cold, hollowed out by betrayal. The second night, I packed a bag. Emily stood in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said flatly, zipping up the duffel. "I just need some space." She stepped closer, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Please, don't leave. We can fix this. I know I've hurt you, but we can't fix it if you're not here." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with, the woman I thought I had built a life with. But that image was quickly overshadowed by the reality of her choices. "I don't know if this can be fixed, Emily," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Right now, I can't even look at you without feeling like I'm drowning." She didn't try to stop me as I walked out the door. I stayed with a friend, Matt, for a few days. He didn't ask many questions, sensing that I wasn't ready to talk. Instead, he offered his spare room, a few beers, and the kind of quiet solidarity that only a lifelong friend can provide. When I finally told him everything, he listened intently, his expression shifting from disbelief to anger on my behalf. "Man, I don't even know what to say," he admitted, shaking his head. "You didn't deserve this. Not one bit." His words were a balm, but they couldn't erase the gnawing ache in my chest. Emily sent texts, each one a plea for communication, for forgiveness. "I'm so sorry. Please come home. We can fix this. I've ended it with him. It's over. I swear." But I couldn't bring myself to respond. Each message felt like salt in an open wound, a reminder of the life I thought I knew unraveling before me. Eventually, I agreed to meet her. Not because I was ready to forgive, but because I needed answers. I needed closure. We met at a park, a neutral ground that felt safer than the intimacy of our home. She sat on a bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from days of crying. When I sat down beside her, the silence stretched between us, thick and oppressive. Finally, she spoke. "I ended it," she said, her voice barely audible. "I told him I couldn't see him anymore." I nodded, my gaze fixed on a patch of grass at my feet. "Why, Emily?" I asked, my voice raw. "Why did you do it?" She took a deep, shuddering breath. "I don't know," she admitted. "I was lonely, I guess. You've been so busy with work, with everything else, and I felt invisible. And then he came along, and he made me feel seen, like I mattered." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "So it's my fault?" I asked, my tone sharp. "No," she said quickly. "That's not what I mean. This is on me, 100%. I made the choice. I broke your trust, and I hate myself for it." I looked at her, searching her face for any sign of deceit, but all I saw was regret, raw and unfiltered. "Do you love him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head vehemently. "No, it wasn't love. It was a mistake. A terrible, selfish mistake. I love you, only you." Her words hung in the air, a fragile offering that I wasn't sure I could accept. The decision to reconcile or walk away felt like an impossible weight pressing down on me. Days turned into weeks, and still, I found myself caught in the liminal space between past and future. Emily's betrayal had severed something vital in our relationship, but the love we'd built over the years lingered, haunting me with its presence. I sought clarity in the quiet moments, long walks through empty streets, staring at old photos, the laughter frozen in time mocking the current chaos, talking with Matt, whose unfiltered perspective was both grounding and jarring. "She's fighting for you," he said one evening, beer in hand. "That means something, but man, don't let her guilt you into staying if it's breaking you." Eventually, I agreed to therapy, not for her or even for us, but for me. I needed to understand my own feelings, the anger, the grief, the lingering hope that clung stubbornly to the edges of my mind. The first session was brutal. The therapist, a calm and collected woman named Dr. Lane, listened as I poured out my story, her expression neutral but attentive. "What do you want?" she asked gently after I finished. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to forgive her, to rebuild what we had, but another part feels like it's impossible, like I'll never be able to trust her again." Dr. Lane nodded. "Both of those feelings are valid. Rebuilding trust is a long, difficult process, and it's okay if you're not ready, or if you decide it's not worth the pain." Her words echoed in my mind as I left the session. Emily suggested joint therapy, and after much deliberation, I agreed. Our first session together was tense, the room filled with unspoken tension. "I want to make this right," Emily said, her voice trembling. "I know I've broken something sacred, and I'll do whatever it takes to fix it. But I need to know if you're willing to try." Her vulnerability was disarming. She didn't make excuses, didn't shift the blame. She owned her actions fully, which only made my inner conflict more pronounced. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I'm here, but that's all I can promise right now." The sessions became a weekly ritual. Slowly, painfully, we began to unpack the layers of hurt and betrayal. Emily shared her struggles, her feelings of isolation, her insecurities, and the way she had sought solace in the worst possible place. I shared my own blind spots, the ways I had taken her for granted, assuming our marriage was unshakable without tending to its foundation. It wasn't easy. Some days I left therapy feeling hopeful, the faint glimmer of a future together just visible on the horizon. Other days I left feeling raw and drained, the magnitude of her betrayal crushing me anew. One evening, months into the process, we sat together in the living room. The air was heavy with unspoken words, but for once it didn't feel suffocating. "I don't know if I'll ever fully trust you again," I said quietly, breaking the silence. "But I'm starting to believe that maybe we can build something new, something different." Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she reached for my hand. "That's all I want. A chance to prove to you that I can be better, that we can be better." Rebuilding wasn't a straight path. There were setbacks, arguments, and moments when the past loomed too large to ignore. But there were also small victories, a shared laugh, a moment of genuine connection, a glimmer of the partnership we had once cherished. Whether we would make it in the long run was still uncertain. But for now, we were trying. And that, I realized, was enough. The months turned into a year, and the journey of rebuilding our relationship was anything but linear. Some days felt like progress, like we were finding a rhythm again, learning how to communicate in ways that felt honest and raw. Other days, the weight of the past dragged us down, forcing us to confront wounds that hadn't fully healed. One of the turning points came unexpectedly. Emily suggested a weekend trip, just the two of us, away from the house that had become a minefield of memories. "We need to remind ourselves of why we fell in love," she said, her voice tentative, as if afraid I'd reject the idea outright. I hesitated, but eventually agreed. We drove to a quiet cabin in the mountains, the isolation offering a strange kind of solace. The first evening, we sat by the fire, the crackling logs filling the silence between us. Emily handed me a journal, its leather cover worn and familiar. "I've been writing," she said softly. "Since everything happened, it's helped me process things. I thought maybe it could help you understand, too." I flipped through the pages, each one filled with her careful handwriting. She had poured herself onto those pages, her guilt, her regrets, her hopes. It was raw and unfiltered, and as I read, I felt something shift within me. For the first time, I saw her not just as the woman who had betrayed me, but as someone deeply flawed and deeply human, someone who was trying, in her own way, to make amends. The trip wasn't a magic cure, but it was a step, a fragile, tentative step, toward rebuilding trust. Back home, we continued therapy, both individually and together. The sessions were a lifeline, helping us navigate the complexities of forgiveness and accountability. About 18 months after the affair came to light, something unexpected happened. Emily planned a small dinner at home for our anniversary, a date I hadn't been sure we'd even acknowledge. When I walked into the dining room, the table was set with candles and soft music played in the background. She looked up at me, her expression nervous but hopeful. "I know this doesn't erase anything," she said, gesturing to the setup, "but I wanted to remind you that I'm still here, that I'm still fighting for us." I looked around the room, at the effort she had put into creating a moment of connection, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something close to peace. "I see you, Emily," I said quietly, taking her hand. "And I'm trying. I really am." That night, as we sat together, I realized that rebuilding wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about learning to live with it. About choosing every day to move forward despite the scars. We weren't the same people we had been before the betrayal, but maybe that was okay. Maybe the people we were becoming had a chance to build something even stronger, something forged in honesty and resilience. As the second year of our rebuilding began, the contours of our life together slowly shifted. The cracks that Emily's betrayal had left in our marriage were still visible, but we were learning to navigate them, to build something new around them. The journey, however, wasn't without its share of haunting reminders. There were moments when I would catch myself second-guessing her actions, wondering if her phone buzzing meant more than it should, or if a lingering glance from a stranger carried unspoken history. One evening, as we folded laundry in silence, Emily broke the quiet. "You still don't trust me, do you?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. I hesitated. "I'm trying," I admitted. "But it's hard to forget. Hard to not wonder." She nodded, her expression pained. "I don't blame you, but I hope you'll tell me when you feel like that instead of keeping it bottled up." The story of her affair, though acknowledged, was not often spoken of directly. It hovered like a shadow, always present but rarely confronted. That changed one night during a particularly heated argument. "I can't keep pretending everything's okay," I shouted, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "I can't just erase the image of you with him." Emily froze, her face pale. Then, unexpectedly, she sat down, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her guilt. "You're right," she said quietly. "You shouldn't have to pretend, and I shouldn't either." For the first time since the affair, she shared everything, every painful detail I had avoided asking about. Her loneliness, her reasoning at the time, the way she had convinced herself it didn't mean anything until it was too late. I wanted to feel wanted, she admitted, tears streaming down her face. But it wasn't real. It was selfish and cruel, and I hate myself for it every day. Hearing her confession was both devastating and strangely liberating. The raw honesty forced me to confront the reality of what had happened, stripping away the imagined scenarios that had haunted me. As part of our therapy, Dr. Lane encouraged us to rewrite the narrative of our relationship, not to erase the betrayal, but to frame it as a turning point. "Rebuilding isn't about going back to what you had," she said. "It's about creating something new, something that acknowledges both the pain and the growth." We began to implement rituals of trust, weekly check-ins where we shared our thoughts, fears, and hopes, open access to each other's digital lives, not as a form of surveillance, but as a gesture of transparency. There were missteps, of course, times when my anger flared or when Emily withdrew, unsure of how to bridge the gap. But each time we found our way back to the conversation, to the commitment we had made to try. The affair wasn't just a story of betrayal. It became a story of transformation. It forced us to confront not only the cracks in our marriage, but the cracks within ourselves. For Emily, it meant grappling with the insecurities and fears that had driven her to seek validation outside our relationship. For me, it meant acknowledging the ways I had unknowingly contributed to the distance between us, and learning to communicate in ways that nurtured rather than neglected. Years later, as we sat on the porch of our home watching the sunset, Emily reached for my hand. "We've been through hell," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "But I'm grateful we made it through together." I squeezed her hand, the weight of the journey settling into something lighter. "Me too," I said. The scars remained, faint but present, a testament to the pain we had endured. But so did the love, a love reshaped and rebuilt, but no less real. As the years unfolded, the complexity of our relationship deepened. The dynamic between Emily and me was no longer about simply rebuilding. It had evolved into an intricate dance of rediscovery, an ongoing exploration of who we were as individuals and who we could be as a couple. Our shared experiences, the pain, the growth, the fragile victories, had become a foundation for a new kind of intimacy. One marked not by blind trust, but by conscious effort, by a raw vulnerability we had never dared to explore before. The quiet resentments. There were still moments when the old wounds resurfaced. Sometimes it was subtle, a fleeting look, a hesitation in her voice, or a shadow crossing my thoughts. One such moment came during a casual dinner with friends. Someone made an offhand comment about loyalty in relationships, and I caught the brief flicker of guilt in Emily's eyes. My stomach tightened, the familiar ache of doubt creeping in. Later that night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Why does it still feel like this? Why can't I just let it go? Emily turned to me, sensing my distance. What's wrong? Nothing, I replied instinctively, then sighed. Actually, no. It's not nothing, it's that comment at dinner. It stirred something up. She nodded, her expression open. I get it, and I don't expect those feelings to disappear overnight, but I hope you'll keep sharing them with me even when it's hard. Her patience in those moments was disarming. It didn't erase the pain, but it made it easier to confront. The unexpected strengths. Ironically, the affair had forced us to become better communicators. What had once been unspoken assumptions about our needs and desires were now the subject of open, sometimes difficult conversations. One evening, as we sat on the couch with a bottle of wine, Emily brought up a topic we had skirted around for years: our individual dreams. Do you ever feel like we've sacrificed too much of ourselves for this marriage? She asked. The question startled me. I don't know, I admitted. But I think we've both changed, maybe more than we realized. What about you? She hesitated, then said, I used to dream of traveling more, of living in different places, but I was so focused on building our life together that I put that aside. Her honesty struck a chord. Maybe it's time we start making space for those dreams, I said. That conversation marked a shift. We began to actively support each other's personal growth, recognizing that nurturing our individual selves was just as important as nurturing our relationship. Rebuilding trust, we learned, wasn't a finish line. It was a journey. It showed itself in the little things, the way Emily would leave her phone on the table, screen up, without hesitation, the way I stopped flinching at every text notification. One day, while cleaning out the attic, I stumbled across an old box of letters and mementos from our early years together. As I sifted through them, I was reminded of the simple, unguarded love we had once shared. When Emily found me sitting there, holding a faded photograph of us from our honeymoon, she smiled softly. That feels like a lifetime ago, she said. It does, I agreed. But maybe that's okay. Maybe this new chapter can be just as meaningful. She knelt beside me, her hand resting on mine. I hope so. Because I'm still choosing us, every day. A new kind of love over time, our love took on a different shape. It was no longer the idealized version we had clung to in our early years. It was messier, more complicated, but also more real. We learned to celebrate the small victories, a shared laugh over an inside joke, a moment of quiet connection after a long day, and we learned to face the hard truths together rather than apart. The emotional depths of our journey were more profound than either of us could have predicted. Beneath the surface of our healing marriage lay currents of unspoken fears, hidden desires, and the complicated process of forgiving, not just each other, but ourselves. The weight of guilt. For Emily, the weight of her guilt was always present, though it ebbed and flowed. Sometimes it would rise up unexpectedly, leaving her physically drained, eyes heavy with a sorrow that felt inescapable. One evening, we were sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was cool, and the hum of crickets filled the silence between us. Emily's voice broke through it, soft but laced with an ache. I can't stop feeling like I don't deserve to be happy, she whispered, staring out at the darkening sky. I turned to look at her, her face partly illuminated by the last vestiges of light. Her vulnerability made my heart tighten. Why would you say that? She swallowed hard, the words heavy on her tongue. Because I hurt you. And no matter what I do, I'll always be the one who broke something beautiful. I don't think I can ever forgive myself for that. Her confession left me speechless. The old part of me, the part that felt the sting of betrayal most sharply, wanted to hold her accountable, to remind her of the depth of her mistake. But another part of me, the part that had watched her struggle to rebuild herself, understood her pain in a way I hadn't before. You are allowed to be happy, I said softly. What you did, it doesn't define you completely, Emily. But I need you to forgive yourself. Because if you don't, this pain will follow you forever. Her shoulders shuddered as she exhaled, the weight of those words settling between us. The burden of unspoken fears. For me, the emotional journey was more about facing the fears I had buried deep inside. The constant worry that I'd never fully trust again, that the shadow of her infidelity would always linger, pulling me back into the past. It wasn't just the betrayal itself that haunted me, but the fear that I wasn't enough, never had been. It surfaced most acutely in quiet moments, when the house was still and my thoughts turned inward. Late one night after Emily had fallen asleep beside me, I lay awake, my mind swirling with uncertainty. What if I'm just fooling myself, I thought. What if I'll never feel the same way about her again? What if I'm only staying out of obligation, not love? I tried to push the thoughts away, but they clung to me, sharp and insistent. I knew I had to confront them, but the idea of facing the truth, that perhaps this wasn't going to work, felt like standing on the edge of a precipice. I turned to Emily's sleeping form beside me, her breath steady and peaceful, and something inside me wavered. For the first time, I saw her not just as the woman who had wronged me, but as someone who was here, present, still fighting. But the fear lingered. How much of myself had I lost in the process of trying to forgive? Was I still the person I had been before the affair, or had I transformed into someone I didn't recognize? The longing for redemption. Despite everything, there were still moments of longing. I could see it in Emily's eyes when she looked at me, this quiet desire to make things right, to show me that she was worthy of my love. She wanted redemption, and more than that, she wanted to be loved in return without the burden of guilt overshadowing every gesture. One evening, we were sitting on the couch, a blanket draped over our legs as we watched an old movie. Her hand brushed against mine, a gentle, tentative touch. I felt the pulse of her fingers against mine, like a silent question. I turned to her, studying her face. There it was again, that quiet yearning for absolution. I love you, I whispered, almost to myself. I don't know what it looks like yet, but I love you, even when it hurts. Her eyes filled with unshed tears. I'm so sorry, she whispered back. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you. In that moment, I realized something crucial. Forgiveness wasn't a destination, it was a process. And we would have to keep choosing each other day by day, even when the old wounds felt fresh, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. The pain of loving. Through scars. There were nights when the weight of it all felt unbearable. The long silence after a difficult conversation. The feeling of Emily's touch when my mind was still tangled in resentment. The emotional exhaustion of navigating a love that had been fractured, knowing that some pieces might never fit back together quite the same way. But in those moments, I also understood something deeper. That love, in its truest form, was never about perfection. It was about the willingness to grow, to fight through the darkness and emerge into the light. I had to let go of the fantasy of a perfect, unscarred love and accept the reality of the one we were building. A love that was built not on the absence of pain, but on the resilience to survive it. And as I looked at Emily, her face still framed by the years we'd shared, I knew that this was the hardest love I would ever know, the love that came with scars, with history, with all the messiness of being human, but it was also the most profound. As we moved further into our journey of rebuilding, we soon discovered that the path wasn't as linear as we had hoped. The lessons we had learned, the newfound understanding of each other's fears, desires, and flaws, these were powerful foundations. Yet life wasn't simply going to allow us to heal in a smooth, uninterrupted arc. New challenges began to emerge, testing the strength of the bond we had worked so tirelessly to rebuild. The arrival of old friends. It started with the visit from Emily's college friends. They had always been a tight-knit group, full of memories from carefree days of youth. Before the affair, before everything had been shaken to its core. I knew they were part of her past, but I hadn't fully prepared for how their presence would stir up old emotions in me. One Saturday afternoon they arrived, full of energy and laughter, immediately filling our house with a sense of nostalgia. They were fun to be around, but the underlying tension between Emily and me simmered just beneath the surface, and I could feel it in the way we interacted. Emily's friend Leah, with her vibrant energy and loud laugh, was quick to ask, "So, how's married life now? You guys are better, right?" It was a simple question, but in my chest, a knot formed. I knew she didn't mean anything by it. She had no idea of the complexity of our situation. But the question dug deeper than I expected. "Better," Emily said, her voice steady, her gaze darting toward me for just a split second. She was trying to ease the tension, but the words hung there, unspoken. Better than what? Than before. Or better than what we had been left with after everything fell apart. I forced a smile, joining the conversation, but the discomfort lingered in the background. Later, in the privacy of our bedroom, Emily turned to me, her face marked with the faintest hint of anxiety. "I know that was hard for you," she said quietly, reaching for my hand. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak immediately. "It wasn't just that," I admitted after a moment. "It's the way they treat us. Like nothing happened. I know you're not responsible for their reactions, but it makes me feel like we're supposed to pretend everything's fine. We've been fine, but we're still healing." Her eyes softened with understanding. "I get it. It's just hard to talk about it with them. They never really knew the depth of what we went through." There was something painful about being expected to carry the weight of that past in silence, to be the only ones who fully understood the complexity of our healing. But there was also something liberating about acknowledging it aloud, about voicing the discomfort, the vulnerability that was still present, even among friends who meant well. The weight of parenthood. A few months later, a new challenge presented itself. Parenthood. It wasn't something we had discussed in depth since the affair. Not because we hadn't wanted it, but because the idea of bringing a child into a relationship that had been fractured felt daunting. Yet, as the years passed, we found ourselves drifting toward the thought of starting a family. At first, the decision seemed simple enough. There was love, there was healing, and there was the shared desire to build a future. But the reality of the situation soon proved to be more complex than we could have anticipated. Emily's longing to be a mother was clear in the way she spoke about the future, but the weight of what had come before, the guilt, the fear of repeating past mistakes, the worry about her ability to fully embrace motherhood was just as clear. One evening, after a particularly emotional conversation about our future, she turned to me, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Do you think I'm ready?" she asked. The question hung in the air, fragile and vulnerable. I had watched her grow so much in the years since the affair, and I knew she had worked hard to become a better version of herself. But the reality of parenting was a monumental shift. I think we both have a lot of healing to do, I said slowly. I think we're still figuring out who we are, both as individuals and as a couple. And I don't think there's ever a perfect time, but... I paused, looking into her eyes. I want to believe that we can give a child a good life. I want to believe that we can do this, but I need to be sure that we're doing it for the right reasons. She nodded, biting her lip as she absorbed my words. It wasn't the answer she was hoping for, but it was the truth. There was no escaping the fact that becoming parents wasn't just about the love we had. It was about the emotional readiness to take on that responsibility together. The strain of transparency. We had committed to transparency in our relationship, a seemingly simple promise, but one that began to unravel in unexpected ways. As the years went by, I found myself wondering if there were parts of our lives that still needed to be kept separate, moments that didn't require total honesty. The smallest lie, the smallest whitewash, felt like it could be the crack that brought it all crashing down again. And while I believed in the power of truth, I began to wonder, how much truth is too much? One night, as we sat in the kitchen, Emily looked at me over her cup of tea. "Is there anything you're hiding from me?" she asked, her voice soft but searching. I froze. The question, though innocent in its phrasing, seemed to carry more weight than I had anticipated. In the quiet of the moment, I realized how many things I had avoided saying, things I hadn't fully processed or been ready to confront. I had been hiding things, small, insignificant details, but things that felt too personal to share. "No," I said, surprised by how easy the word came. "But there's stuff I haven't figured out, things I'm still working through." She smiled gently, but I could see the flicker of relief in her eyes. "We're still figuring it all out, aren't we?" The words carried a truth that resonated deeply. We were still navigating the labyrinth of our marriage, one that had been broken and healed, but never completely whole. And every day, we faced the challenge of deciding how much to reveal, how much to carry, and how much to leave behind. The challenge of personal growth. For me, the biggest challenge wasn't the rebuilding of our marriage, it was the rebuilding of myself. Who was I now after all of this? Who was I beyond the man who had been betrayed and hurt? I began to explore my own goals and aspirations, things I had suppressed over the years in favor of building a life with Emily. I began to reconnect with old passions, with the versions of myself I had abandoned. But that, too, created strain. Emily, though supportive, was also grappling with her own transformations and uncertainties, and sometimes it felt like we were moving in opposite directions, rather than growing together. Would we continue to support each other's growth, or would the very act of evolving pull us further apart? That became the central question as I pursued new career goals and personal development, uncertain if our paths were truly aligned or if they were becoming divergent. The intersection of hope and doubt it was in these moments, when the weight of uncertainty seemed insurmountable, that we returned to the core truth of our relationship. We had already survived the worst of it. But could we continue to survive the future together? Would we find a way to love without the lingering fear of betrayal, without the scar of what we had endured? Or would the complexities of life, of our ever-evolving selves, continue to push us toward a point of no return?